Hello and welcome to this Economist Events webinar sponsored by InterSystems, entitled Health Data Economy Vehicles for Discovery. While some healthcare systems are drowning in data, bringing both opportunities and headaches, other systems, particularly in low and middle income countries, suffer from a data drought. Large healthcare datasets, when they exist, can be mined to support knowledge discovery, predictive analytics, and help create more efficient business models. However, to do that, we need to be able to share data effectively. And sharing requires a complex combination of technical, regulatory, ethical, and policy frameworks. Even the most experienced data organizations can come unstuck. Witness, for example, the recent news stories around Google's Project Nightingale. While there are some successful country initiatives like the UK's 100,000 Genomes Project and the All of Us project in the US, for the most part, there is a global patchwork of mismatched consent and privacy rules that complicate even basic information sharing for patient care. Even when the rules do align, the data itself, held in a variety of formats and systems, often do not. These are all major roadblocks in attempts to make data a tangible public good. In order to discuss these issues, I'm very pleased to have with me an illustrious panel. We have Samira Asma, the Assistant Director General for Data Analytics and Delivery for Impact from the World Health Organization. We have Joshua Denny, the Chief Executive of the National Institute of Health All of Us Research Programme. Mark Caulfield is with us, the Chief Scientist of Genomics England, and Alex McLeod, who's Head of Global Healthcare Initiative at InterSystems. So if I could turn to you, Alex, maybe to kick us off, could you just maybe say a few words about yourself and InterSystems, but also why is data sharing so important? What's all the fuss about?
Sure. Very good question. And obviously, we've been in the interoperability business for decades at this point. And it's, as you mentioned, there's a lot of barriers to getting data out of systems and then together and make it kind of useful for research or predictive health, predictive analytics, public health. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that tracking this type of information is important. So we have to figure out how to do better, how to overcome some of these barriers, I think. And that's what we're spending, most of our time doing every day.
Great. Thank you. Josh, could I come to you and ask you to tell us a bit about the All of Us Research Programme and what it aims to accomplish?
Certainly. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. It is a pleasure. The All of Us Research Program is designed as a project that will be longitudinal, partnering with 1 million or more participants for potentially decades to gather electronic health record data, survey data, biospecimens, doing whole genomes on individuals, and a number of other biomarkers over time. It's really designed as a longitudinal disease agnostic study to discover hopefully many things about disease, treatment, and health over time.
And Mark, I was wondering if you could similarly give a brief introduction to Genomics England. I wonder if it's a UK equivalent to the All of Us programme, but also just say a few words to introduce us to how routinely collected health data combined with genomic data, such as you do, how that can support healthcare transformation.
Thank you, Alan. It's likewise with colleagues here. It's a great pleasure to be amongst you all in such an illustrious panel. Genomics England was founded by the UK government to deliver the 100,000 Genomes project, and it's a wholly owned Department of Health and Social Care company. So it works like a company, but according to government principles, and is essentially owned by the UK taxpayer. The mission of Genomics England is to transform healthcare. So we've done that using the 100,000 Genomes project, which has now created a national genomic test directory and new genomic medicine service, bringing regional equity of access to genomic testing across 56 million people in England, but also priming the way for 500,000 whole genomes to be investigated as part of routine healthcare over the next 5 years. And our experience in bringing clinical, routinely gathered real-world data direct from the health system means that we have 3.8 billion clinical data points alongside 111,000 genomes today, a rich longitudinal life course resource that can be used to transform healthcare, create the arguments for adoption by health systems, and is pioneering the way to have a transformed precision healthcare system in the UK.
Great, thank you. 3.8 billion data points. One of my questions later, I was thinking about, do we have too much or too little data? But maybe we can come back to that. Samira, can you tell us a little bit about the World Health Data Hub and the 3 billion targets that you at the WHO are working on, and how they might help to fill in some of the data gaps I mentioned in my introduction?
Thank you, Alan, and delighted to be among the panelists and honored to be here. And thanks to The Economist and the InterSystems for holding this timely discussion. And the question that you asked about how we build an innovative health data systems and the work that we are doing here at WHO is quite timely. And it has been occupying a lot of our time at WHO since Dr. Tedros took the office. The first thing he wanted to, as a part of his vision, was to make WHO a modern, data-driven organization with the recognition that we are amidst a lot of data, but often the data is fragmented. I will answer the questions in two parts. One is, what are the 3 billion targets that WHO is aiming towards? These are sustainable development goals based, and each of the targets relate to 1 billion more people realizing universal health coverage, 1 billion more people protected from health emergencies, and 1 billion more people living healthier life over the course of the next 5 years, which started in 2018. It is an ambitious agenda, but we were faced with the COVID pandemic in 2020. And not only we have been derailed with the SDGs, we have to come back on track. And we are hoping, and our ambition is that the 3 billion targets will really help us use the data to drive progress and make a measurable impact in the lives of the people we serve. So that is the vision of WHO, being accountable to our member states and to the partners. Data is fundamental and critical in this work. And we have also seen that with COVID, we have not been able to do some basic counting. And we recently launched WHO's Score for Health Data report. It is the first global assessment that we have done for assessing countries' health data systems. And what we found is that 4 out of 10 people do not have a death registration. And this became quite prominent as we were counting the deaths related to COVID. And this is due to the varied capacity in countries in terms of the health information systems. And we have also found that most of the well-developed countries also have had challenges. While there is a lot of data and health information system capacity, but the fragmented data systems that are not interoperable or perhaps not accessible has caused a lot of delays in responding to the pandemic. And when we look at the least developed countries, we see that there is not only lack of data, but also that there are systems that are not in place. So WHO's focus now is to bring the partners together to create a World Health Data Hub that will truly be an open source, open access, real-time, transparent data that will help everyone, every country to be better prepared for future pandemics, but also to track the progress we are making or not making towards the health-related sustainable development goals.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you for that. And it's a wonderful comparison there between the 3.8 billion data points that maybe Health England is sitting on and the 40% of deaths not being recorded in some of the countries you're working with, which gives us an idea of that sort of gap in terms of data availability and use. So there are 4 areas that I'd like us to talk about today, if we can. The first is around the sort of collection of data and some of the more technical challenges involved in that. Then I'd like to move on to trust and ownership, of course, big topics around data sharing in healthcare. So who owns the data? Why does that matter? Then I'd like us to go on to regulation, and can regulation ever keep up in such a fast-moving field? And then finally to talk about the development of a data economy. After all, we are told that data is the oil of the 21st century. So how can we make use of that oil in the same way that it transformed 18th century economies? So I guess kicking off on that sort of collecting the data and on a technical side, could we just briefly start with a discussion about the difference between structured and unstructured data and what some of the technical hurdles are in acquiring and using that data? And I'm wondering, Josh, if you could maybe kick off that. I know you've worked with electronic health records now, which are often a bit of a mishmash of the two. Could you say a few words about that?
Certainly. Our goal with all of us is to really capture the robustness of electronic health record data, as well as the data that can be provided other places as well. So, I would say communities have gotten the most advanced with dealing with structured data like visits, medications, lab results, and even, making those interoperable and harmonized is an incredible challenge. I like to think of that as a journey, not a destination. We have more than 50 data providers, 16 different EHR vendors, different versions amongst those vendors that are contributing data into one harmonized data model. And even getting the structured data there has been something we've worked really hard at doing across those data points. In addition, I think there's a lot of value in the unstructured information. So that, from the electronic health record context, that would be imaging data, that would be the narrative text from clinical notes, procedure notes, reports, from echocardiograms and interpretations, pathology, radiology, all those kinds of things. We've done a lot of work in the past with natural language processing, de-identification of those kind of data. Machine learning approaches and artificial intelligence will be, I think, real keys to how we unlock the potential of those kinds of data. They're really critical for rare disease, unusual circumstances, adverse events from drugs. Really or getting at that raw data is really helps you understand those kinds of diseases in a way that the structured data may not be as valuable or give you the depth of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, Mark, you face similar challenges in Genome England there. How do you go about making that unstructured data, which is often the richest data maybe available? How do you go about making that usable?
So, Alan, I agree with Josh, actually, that receiving as much data from as many sources is hugely valuable. So there's several ways in which we approach that. I'll give you one example. We longitudinally life course follow everyone for their entire life, including until after death, and can obtain the cause of death. During that journey, they may have cancer episodes. We have a national cancer registry. We used to receive a curated, fully optimized data set, a so-called normalized data set. But we found that this was lacking in information. And so now we have the raw data feed, which comes in every month in almost real time, direct from the hospitals. This comes in to visualize it. It looks like a word and number salad. It's all kind of mixed up. And then in amongst there are absolute jewels. So, for example, in the pathology report, we can usually recover most of the data we need to stage the cancer, give a clear evidence of the site, where to look on images, and to orientate people, and the pathology and the immune infiltration that's occurred. So really quite granular clinical data points that allow us to assemble a really deep picture of that individual and their cancer journey. We can also use that type of real-world data accrual to follow people beyond trials so that we can begin to see side effects that mightn't be detected or benefits that haven't been observed within the trial context but can be seen by the real-world data as you follow those people up. And there are people in the program in rare disease who, because of the high proportion of clinical terms we've been able to collect from multiple sources, they're clinicians, in addition, electronic health records, we see a direct proportionality to diagnostic yield to the number of clinical data terms that you have characterizing that individual. So I would say in the 21st century, one of the key lessons for all of us is you can never have enough data, and that the data that you have may come in a variety of forms, and it may be, as Josh alluded to around all of us, it may be necessary to accept the constraints of various providers and be willing to work on that data to optimize and standardize its format using internationally accepted ontologies. So if I want to talk to Josh's data in all of us or other people's data here, I can do so because we've used the same anchorage in the same ontology, and we don't have an apples and pears situation with the data. Therefore, we can choose to combine data and use international frameworks to do so, such as the Global Alliance for Genomic Health, which is encouraging the use of application programming interfaces to directly connect data centers in different jurisdictions.
Okay, yes, I wanted to talk about... Oh, yes, go on, Alex, please do.
Can I add to that? Because the colleague has made some very good points, I think, and I like you can never have enough data. And we deal with a lot of different users of that data, right? So one of the main ones, obviously, is clinical staff looking at a screen in an ED department. We actually had one of our customers tell us, I'm actually looking for a needle in a haystack, and UIT people keep giving me more hay. And especially if you think about massive amounts of unstructured data, and Josh mentioned this, natural language processing, machine learning, we've gained some huge strides in how to make sense of that data. What we're really focused on then is, marry that up with the structured data, and not just clinical, but claims data, social determinants of health. They all influence and kind of have an impact on the wellness of a patient, which to me is always the end goal, of taking care of that patient somehow. So if we can combine, making sense of unstructured data, marry that up with the structured data, and then kind of pinpoint the important parts that you have in that sea of information, I think that's the golden grail.
I completely agree, and that's exactly what we do. We use natural language processing to take out key terms, make them into a structured data set, and we run that all the time as we receive the data. And that filters it, and therefore it becomes usable for the clinician, and it's no longer a haystack to search through.
And so that natural language processing and the related tools, I'd always had the impression that we still were at a point where we've got so much data, but just not really yet the tools to be able to use it. Have we turned the corner there? Are we still limited in what we can do in our capabilities to make use of it? Or are we at the point now where we've got the natural language processing, we've got the machine learning? It's okay.
I would argue that it's both and. I think there's a lot more to be done, but we also have tools to make sense of a lot of data. We have the computing facilities that we can really take in the entire amount of data that we have now. There still are some computing challenges that exist there, but by and large, that's not the limiter. And so, as Mark said, you can never have too much data. And having all that raw data and that raw signal, we can process the data with good speed and make a lot of things available. Those algorithms to parse documents with natural language processing tools and those sorts of things are still developing, though, and especially in the medical arena. We're far ahead in the non-medical arena than we are in the medical arena, I think, because a lack of availability of text, the lack of the ad hoc way in which documents are written by physicians and the on-the-fly abbreviations. We found that abbreviations, the same abbreviations, mean different things in Nashville than they do in Houston, things like that are just replete amongst it. Nonetheless, there's an incredible amount of information there, and we can process it pretty well. So there's no harm in gathering it and using it today. It'll just get better over time.
I actually fully agree with that. And I think the clinical domain is also very complex, right? So I don't think we'll ever replace a clinician, for example. But you can get a lot of information from unstructured data and pinpoint, where you focus your resources, where might there be an outbreak, for example, to get back to the pandemic again. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do to just get enough information to tell us what makes sense to look at in more detail.
Okay. So clinicians are able to record their interaction with a patient using their own words in an unstructured manner. They don't have to select drop-down menus in order to ensure a robust ontology. We do actually have the tools now, for the most part, to be able to take that natural language and create structured data with it. By the sounds of it. Yeah.
So I think it's a mixed economy, Alan, at the moment. So it's useful to collect data that you really, really know you want to have in some degree of structure. But if you really want a granular picture of people and you want to assemble very large amounts of data, then we have to reach a point where we can do what Josh and Alex are advocating, which is to use routinely collected healthcare data. And by replaying that back to clinicians and showing them where it's good and where it's not good and what you can get out of it, creating a culture in the health system where people want to supply the right data first time, ideally. But also, I would say the beauty of the unstructured data, and I think to Samira's earlier point, this will become really important at World Health Organization level, because standardizing things globally is quite hard. We've got to obviously try and do that. But if you accept some noise in the data, what you find is the scale of the data starts to reveal niche patterns, things that you wouldn't have seen if I or Josh or Alex or Samira had constrained it with our prior knowledge. So the beauty of what we're doing today is we're collecting health data in a way that we will bring new insights out of it, because we haven't put any prior model around it and constrained it in any way by the knowledge we've had, which is, of course, by definition, old knowledge. So it opens a new vista on biology, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Samira, you're nodding away there. I was wondering if from the WHO side, also I think you're involved with the IHME, aren't you, with the sort of standardization of outcomes, particularly from lower and middle income countries. What are some of the challenges around the collection of data? Does this all sound quite familiar, or are there unique challenges that you face on
No, I think the discussion that is being shared here is a reflection of what we see all around the world in many countries. There are various data systems that are needed to make insights, to do forecasting, and to be ahead of the curve in trying to assess the health of an individual or the health of the population, and take corrective measures, either to accelerate or to remove the roadblocks, and put in the right interventions at the right place at the right time. And data really helps inform that. And many data streams that are needed, as was discussed earlier, one is patient record. One is to use at the hospital or primary health care or the district health center. What we see is a mix of gathering data through the very traditional paper pencil registries, often get input into an automated system or perhaps not. So there is a scenario in that regard. Then we have very sophisticated hospital-based electronic medical records. Often, even in the best case scenarios, we see that there is lack of interoperability. the standards become very important, especially the international classification of diseases that our group manages. That becomes extremely important as anyone in the sphere of health, public health, is gathering information, whether it is related to diseases or it is related to public health interventions and policies. So we see a mix. Then we look at the population and surveillance systems, whether the surveillance of genomes, surveillance of viruses, or population risk behaviors. We need those platforms as well. We see that everyone gathers information on census every 10 years, count everyone, child, adult, in the country. What we have been thinking is, as we collect that information, why shouldn't we also add a module where we collect the health status of everyone in a country at a given time every 10 years? But in the interim, we can install standardized approaches to data collection measures that using whether it is face-to-face interviews or mobile or even crowdsourcing. And today, technology and innovation offers us that limit the time it takes to gather information. But if we put in the right questions and gather the right information and have the insights that are needed, I think we would be much ahead of the game. But the challenge is the fragmentation that we are all experiencing between countries, within countries, and there is inequalities that we must also acknowledge and try to address those. Without data, we can't do that.
Yeah. Okay. I want to move on. We could talk about collection of data for the whole hour, but I want to move on to trust and ownership. And I want to kick us off with the question of who owns the data we're talking about. Is it the person whose data it is, or is it the organization who collects it? And maybe around this, well, who should it be? Mark, do you mind kicking us off with some thoughts on that?
Not at all, Alan. So in the 100,000 Genomes project, our data supply comes from the NHS, from a legally incorporated body that's called NHS Digital, who provides all NHS data to programs like ours. So essentially, the clinical data is provided from the National Health Service and is derived from National Health Service work, so is owned by the NHS. Our view has been that your genome doesn't stop being your genome because you have gifted your DNA to me under informed consent to sequence it. So your genome is your genome, and you can ask for it back at any time. And you are giving it to us as a gift. And the combination of the genomic data and the clinical data and the product of that, we give back essentially to the NHS and to researchers. We maintain ownership and data controllership of the data, and we give access to the data from a trusted research environment. So, Alan, it acts like a reading library, not a lending library. So we don't transfer data around the world. People come through their desktop as we're looking at screens now, and they have a password, and any bona fide researcher from anywhere in the world, and there are 3,560 from 33 countries who have access to the data. If they're in a bona fide hospital, bona fide educational or university institute, they can have free access to the data. And then they export their summary through an airlock and they take it away, and then they publish it, and their publication has their copyright. But we treat the primary clinical data as owned by the National Health Service, is derived from National Health Service activity. The genomic data is and a gift to us to use alongside the clinical data, and the product of that is then taken away by researchers and published. And we own the product of that, but we own it in a sense for the common good. We will share the intellectual property that's derived with it with anybody who has a reasonable claim on it. We're only interested in the greater good of humanity. That's our role.
Okay. Does that sound similar to the sort of relationship you have, Josh, with the American citizens and other organizations?
I would say there's a lot of analogies in how Mark explained it and what happens in the United States. Similarly, we don't have a national health service as everyone is well aware. But the local hospitals would own the healthcare data on their participants. Like Genomics England, we are aggregating data from a number of sources. And what I would talk about is, there's a difference between ownership and access and governance. And so, though the hospitals may own the healthcare data, HIPAA, mandates that patients have access to their data. And so one of the silo busting parts of our program is the fact that participants can have the right to take their health record data and share that to us for research. And so then we take it to our data center. We believe that the return of value to participants is really a core value of ours. And so that means access to their data. That means access to their genomic data. And we're, already returning some basic genetic ancestry and genetic traits. Individuals who are going to return health-related traits, and we support them with genetic counseling resource. As they get, we're going to build out stuff so they can see stuff around their electronic health record data that we collect as well. And we actually have some pilots with that going now. So, even though their ownership may lie someplace else, the law tells them that they can share that to us for the greater good and for research, and to have them have access as well. The one other part I'll talk about there is the research environment. I liked how Mark talked about how the research model Genomics England has deployed is very similar to what we're doing. The model stated a different way as I love the library analogy. I think of it, instead of bringing the data to the researchers, bring the researchers to the data. So we have a cloud-based environment. They go through a web interface just like many of us are on today, and they come into an environment. A authorized researcher does all their work within our data environment. That not only protects the data and allows centrally enforceable security and privacy, it also means that you democratize access. And so you don't have to think about 1 million genomes and the processing power taking to compute upon that. You don't have to have a huge data cluster at your institution. It allows a more of an equalization of an equitable access for researchers to do research as well. So not only does it protect things, it should accelerate the research done. Now we're much younger. We've just had our data environment open, I guess around 10 months now. But we're already seeing a diversity of researchers come in, and we believe that's a powerful paradigm to accelerate research and better protect the data.
Yeah, so it's not simply a case of ownership, but as you say, sort of access, notions about the greater good. Samira, again, I'm thinking you coming at it from a slightly different background here. Again, if you have any thoughts about data ownership, but also branching this out a little bit in terms of trust. Again, particularly in some of the countries you're working in, it might be lower middle income. Are there challenges around trust as well as ownership when people start talking about healthcare data?
Trust is very important, and it must become the DNA in the way we collect and report or disseminate and share data. We are working with certain data principles that data belongs to the country, and as we gather data, that we ensure that the right to privacy is protected. It is in alignment with the Constitution of the UN Human Rights. And there are technologies now available to mask the data and make it anonymized. the data principles are important guide, and at the same time, we are making available capacity building for countries to ensure that the data that is being collected at the patient level or at the population level is managed according to these standards. The other aspect is about the data sharing policies. WHO has two data sharing policies. One is during emergency context and the other one during non-emergency context. We recently had a very detailed review of data sharing policy during the non-emergency context, and our belief is that data is public good. It should be made available as early as possible and to many with easy access. But at the same time, it is supposed to ensure the privacy of the citizens. We are undergoing a review of data sharing policy during the emergency setting. However, about 30 partner organizations under the UN Secretary General signed a statement of data collection, data management, and data sharing during COVID pandemic, and reaffirmed that the privacy and confidentiality of the data and the person should be at the center of our work.
That's very interesting, that differentiation between emergency and sort of non-emergency use. Right. And we've spoken about how the data might philosophically belong almost to the patient, but in some sort of harder reality, it might belong to the NHS, or it might belong to the health system, or it might belong to the country. I'd like to just talk about data portability, is what I believe is called. So this idea, and you touched on it earlier, Mark, where a person literally does own their own data and is able to take it away, and I'm going to share it with you and share it with you, but I'm not going to share it with you, that sort of thing. I don't know if Alex, if you, again, have any thoughts about the wider issues we've been discussing, but also, again, this idea of data portability, where the individual patient can have much more practical control over their data much more effectively. Is that something we're moving towards, and would that be a good thing?
I hope so. So, and we work in a lot of different countries, which makes it a little dizzying with all the different regulations. So if you look at HIPAA or GDPR or the Australian Privacy Act, everywhere the patient kind of needs to consent to share their data. But as Samira said, for research purposes, it doesn't necessarily need to be tied to an identifiable individual. So you could remove that connection, still make it valuable. And then inside of countries, if I just look at the states, right? So we work, for example, with HealthX, which is a regional exchange in the, operating under New York state law, but they see patients from Connecticut, from Pennsylvania, from New Jersey. And then the consent around minors is really complicated. So people almost get scared to cross boundaries and even consent to having their information shared. If I take myself as an example, this was a couple years ago already, but I was asked in my patient portal for my PCP to share my information with the state HIE. And I said no. And I live and breathe this every day. So if I'm nervous and mistrusting, that's a problem. There's some work we have to do. The idea of a patient portal or something that puts the patient in control of their own health and feels more empowered, where they can selectively, share that information either electronically or even download it and bring it to the next place. That's certainly ideal, but there's still a lot of barriers to doing that. I think we have to. Someone said, where I think it was Josh talking about the greater good, which we have to make more demonstrable, I think, so ideally, if I can take the insight that we, kind of garner from all of this information and then operationalize it back to the patient, where, I log in and I see certain risk factors that are associated with my behavior, maybe that'll motivate me to change in my daily, life, or it'll make me feel more confident when I deal with a care provider or my care team. So, we have some work to do, but to me, that's the ideal, that, everything to the benefit of the patient and the patient being in control of their own kind of destiny.
Yeah, so people will feel more comfortable sharing when they feel there's a value to it, to themselves, not just a sort of
Right.
theoretical value. A slightly crass question, which I'll put to everyone here, but it's often said how we are living almost in an age, a post-privacy age. People are happy for their data to be shared out on Facebook, on Twitter, on social media. We are on CCTV cameras all day long. And yet people are still very nervous about their health data and sharing it. Why do we think that is? Does anybody?
Alan,
Well,
if I may come in. I think the nervousness is because a lack of clarity in terms of how the custodians are going to use and share the data at the patient level or at the population level. Many countries may not have the checks and balances that we see in the most developed countries, the policies that are already in place. There may not be those in many of the countries, or the knowledge on how to implement those policies at the local or subnational level. I think one is lack of information. The second is lack of implementing the policies if the policies are in place. And the third is not having the right policies. The innovation and technology has really has been speeding so fast, and it has been hard to keep up with the policies and the guidelines. WHO is preparing for a global data governance summit uh, to really take a deep look and a broad look as to the data and the types of data that should be shared, the technology, the digital and data interface, and what are the challenges and what are the solutions that the technology offers in anonymization and also then sharing of the data. And the third area is in terms of the legal and the ethical consent and how individual patient relationship and exchange of information relates to that. So hopefully we will have all the best experts and minds coming together this year to chart out a very clear pathway aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals data sharing policy as a whole, but with the premise that by default data should be shared openly, as we have seen in terms of the pandemic, that it is important that we have timely, reliable information.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. When is that event happening?
We are hoping in autumn or in fall.
Okay. Excellent. Mark, I think you were going to come in.
I think that the key thing here is public and patient trust and confidence. And you build that by engaging the public and patients from the outset. And I think keeping them involved. So in the programs that we do, pretty much like all of us, we have people involved before we do anything, during doing it, and afterwards. And they sit inside our organization across our groups. And these people they're independent, but they also become ambassadors for data sharing. And Alan, I suppose what I would say is they're far less conservative than often the investigators who are looking after their data in the way in which they would like to see their data mobilized and marched into healthcare. They have a different view. First of all, in the case of our program, they're usually suffering with a rare disease, a cancer, or some form of severe propensity to infection, and so, therefore they are living with the disease. And they want as many people using this data to find out why they're like they are, whether there's a better treatment for them, as can happen. And I think that Josh spoke to this a bit earlier, and I think Alex was alluding to it. If I want to ask you for your data, I better be able to tell you what I'm going to do with it. And then if what I want to do with it changes, I need to keep you up to speed with it. But certainly in the UK, there's huge trust in data. And in fact, the public and patients think we share data much more readily than we do between hospitals and family physicians. In the UK now, most people, I have access to my family physician or GP record, so I can see what's in it electronically. I can go in there and look. It's a summary of the data, but it's still quite extensive. It's not the level of granularity we'd necessarily want to work on here. But all of these measures, by giving people access, by including them in the processes, by letting them shape the research that's delivered from their program, this is about a trust-building exercise. And of course, the other thing that the public and patients worry about is they're all receiving various different scams every day over the World Wide Web. People trying to get them to reveal their bank account details. But actually, our experience in our 35-strong participant panel is that they have a very, very realistic view of this. They know that they're receiving these emails every day themselves, so they understand that there is no absolute security of these systems. And you asked about portability. One of the strengths of our program is that if you grow big data sets, and I mean big data sets, not just in the number of data points, but in the size of what the footprint is that data occupies. And that's the case today with whole genome sequencing. Then transferring that around becomes pretty uneconomical pretty quickly. But to Josh's earlier point, giving democratic access to everybody, irrespective of their country or ability to pay, is actually a hugely democratizing moment. And it means that people with smart ideas in countries where researchers couldn't have thought of raising the money to have such an environment themselves, they can suddenly become empowered to bring their ideas to bear. And that's how I think we create the data sharing. It's less about data moving around, more about how we connect the data and the standards which we apply to connect that data, which build the trust and confidence that let people have this, let us have this data and be the custodians on their behalf. So it's a trust thing, I think, in the main.
Okay, lots of really interesting points there. And I like that idea of it's not about data moving around, but it's about access from different places. So the data stays where it is. It comes back to your earlier analogy about reading rather than a lending library. I want to move on to regulation, and we've touched on some of these issues already. In particular, it was mentioned earlier about this data, healthcare data, being part of the greater good. I'm wondering if, when thinking about data regulation and how this data is used, does the greater good label make things easier or harder for developers? I don't know if, Alex, you want to kick us off with any thoughts about that?
Well, I think Mark actually made a very important point just now, saying, you need to be able to tell people exactly how that data is going to be used. Because just saying it's being used for the greater good, there's a lot of mistrust that's been building in the last couple of decades. You mentioned Google Nightingale earlier, Alan, so that's just ingrained in people right now. So you need to educate them how that data is going to be used for greater good and how that benefits them as an individual going forward, or their kids. I always think about how is something going to benefit my kids in 10, 20, 30 years. The other thing that I think would help, but it is not very practical, at least right now yet, I think technology is actually ahead there, is granularity. So, can you, and not this all or nothing approach. Can I say, okay, I'm totally fine giving you almost all of my data except for anything mental health related, or substance abuse, or, if I could be more granular in what type of information I share for what purpose, that would make, patients maybe feel more confident in doing that. But it's very difficult to put that into practice, I think.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the Project Nightingale. I was going to ask maybe Josh, not getting into details of Project Nightingale, but obviously Google came in for a bit of criticism, but also many people spoke about HIPAA and whether or not the regulations are keeping up and can ever keep up with the fast moving sort of digital field. Do you think that government regulations of a field such as healthcare data can ever be useful and up to date? And is there another way to regulate the sector without the behemoth of government regulations?
Well, I think regulation is probably important. I think one of the things this gets to, and Nightingale really highlights, is the difference between the consented model where you can build participant trust over time. And, all of us deploy as a consented model. We have a video process, questions afterwards. We have participants that have been involved from every step from the very beginning, as Mark mentioned, through to all of our governance levels now. And so, we have that kind of we really are seeking to build that kind of trust with our community and being transparent and, making visible all the kind of work that's happening on the platform and that sort of thing. Contrasting that with the, legal, ways in which research can be done with data in identifying stripped manners, de-identified, privacy-protected kind of manners in which research can be done, like Nightingale was purporting to do, not getting into the detail of the efficacy of how they were actually pursuing all that. And those models, I think, are the ones that we really have to be careful for. And you have to, that's where regulation really comes into play, I think, largely in trying to really establish our de-identification schemes and what they look like, and having some certainty in what it looks like. It's interesting that we have any standard in the U.S. for de-identification because of reaction to some research that was able to identify people with, without names, with some common attributes, and that discovery led to the provisions of HIPAA, which provide some protection that I would say have provided some direction since 1996 that have been really helpful for how things are done in this manner. But it is an ever evolving space because the number of resources that you can use to triangulate on someone's identity is always increasing. And those present some of the challenges, especially when you're talking about the non-consented components. I just want to mention one other thing in this regard that Samira mentioned that I think is worth discussing is the difference between the rapid reaction in a global pandemic and the facility in which we were able to mobilize data to respond quickly as a global community, and sort of the more, sort of routine, maybe, I don't want to say less urgent, because healthcare and health is always an urgent consideration, but, outside of the global pandemic situation. And I think those are probably two different scenarios. And it's great to see that there's an architecture around considering those scenarios differently.
Yeah. And actually, Samira, I'd like to come on to you, and I realize we're running out of time here rapidly, and we haven't got onto the data economy, but I know something that you're working with is you are aware that with more and more private sector organizations are collecting data in many low and middle income countries with little or no sort of regulatory system in place. And how can we go about building better and more robust sort of public-private partnerships for data collection and sharing?
Thank you for asking the question on public-private partnership. And I think it is crucial that the public-private partnership must work towards a common goal. The pandemic has really taught us an important lesson. And there are intersections that I think would really help us advance so that the world and every country is better prepared. So gathering information from various sources, not only from the public, patients, or from the environment, whether it is the climate or transportation and many other avenues. WHO is promoting and working with the private sector, and you have seen with regard to the infodemics, we have had the opportunity to work with many of the private sector technology firms coming together and supporting WHO's work. In terms of how these enterprises and commercial entities work in developing countries, the other side is for us as a multilateral organization to inform and to advise our member states with the data policies and the governance systems, and to provide that capacity for countries. But we need trust, I think. We need a data highway for everyone to utilize in a manner that we subscribe to principles and policies and share and use the data to advance. Ultimately, our common goal is to improve lives and save lives. So it is a hybrid of public-private partnerships, but also governed by policies and guidelines.
So in our last 5 minutes, we need to cover the data economy. I'm just going to pose one question, which I'll put to everyone in turn. Feel free to answer another question. You've got about a minute each to wrap up. So my question is, I am concerned other industries proceed by disruptive innovation, may or may not agree with that analysis. And I worry that the healthcare data sector is so regulated and so nervous about many things that disruptive innovation in effect can't happen. And that therefore we're going to see slow development compared to many other industries. Do you agree? Is that nonsense? How do we get around that? 1 minute each, I'm afraid. Alex, I'll start with you. Any thoughts on that? Or anything else about the data economy?
I think that's a really interesting question. And it is difficult in healthcare, I think, for all the reasons that we've just talked about. And, I think Samira also touched on this. There's always these different motivations too, depending on, who is driving the exchange. Is that life sciences? Is it health systems? Is it payers? For disruptive innovation, I do feel like we're slower, but I'm optimistic, especially if you look at inventions like, there's a lot of standards out there. That's the good thing about standards, I guess. But with fire, fire coming up, and Mark was touching on this earlier, where I can on demand pull information without, changing where that information lives. That's it might not seem that way yet, but I think it can lead to something that's more innovative in this sector, so we're seeing different types of vendors putting up fire repositories, offering, on-demand access to data. So I'm optimistic for the future. I know I only have a minute, but we need to do some education for the individuals and the public though, because otherwise, if nobody is willing to share their information, all the technology isn't going to do us any good.
Okay, excellent. A minute and a half. Samira, your final minute.
I think we have to seize the moment here now. Public-private partnerships and all partners, multilateral, bilateral, and member states ought to come together. Just look at how we do weather forecasting, how the data is gathered by a World Meteorological Organization just few blocks away from headquarters here in Geneva, with all the satellites from various countries that have sponsored the satellites, and the information is gathered and dispersed to forecast, to predict, and to be prepared. And I think we really need a mind shift, and this is the moment that we must all seize by using, collecting, and making it all simple and easy without compromising the privacy of the individual. And it is possible. So I'm optimistic.
Excellent. Too optimistic so far. 2 out of 4. Josh, I'll come on to you next.
Well, I'm going to be optimistic too. My focus at the NIH is really thinking about the research infrastructure and how we can change that environment and how that can trickle down to really changing healthcare in general. I think some fundamental challenges we're thinking about that we really haven't talked about much here, but is inbound with everything else we're discussing is the real need to increase diversity and representation in the research that we do. And those disparities are very present in our country and are certainly across the world. By bringing in, building trust, by making the state involvement, involving participants, giving them data back that they can go take to their primary care doctors and their specialists with genomics, I think will foster an environment with more information sharing, with more equitable sharing, and more advancement of precision medicine towards all. So I'm bullish on the effect that that we can help promote those kinds of environments through big research projects like we're pursuing that Mark and I lead in our countries to give access to others and empower them.
Great. Not only optimistic, but bullish. I like that. So, Mark, I'm hoping as a fellow Brit, you'll be pessimistic. But
I'm afraid I might be about to disappoint you, Alan. We've seen during the recent pandemic the huge value of data sharing under urgent public health regulations. That's allowed us to mobilize trials like the recovery trial, with which within months we were able to learn that giving a steroid would be useful to help with severe illness and could save lives, 1 in 8 lives possibly saved. We did that in a timescale we couldn't have imagined over a year ago, and that is through data sharing and data access. In fact, we have the vaccines because colleagues in China decided to share their sequence of the virus very early on, which helped us, along with innovations and other science, to get a potential route out of this. We're not out of it yet, and there's a distance to go. So I'm really optimistic. And to give you a measure of the optimism, the United Kingdom is considering creating a national data asset for digital trials, which would allow rapid startup of studies, the ability to do feasibility of who to include in study, all from direct healthcare data, and to do that to work with companies around the world so that we can rapidly accelerate innovation for the benefit of the whole of the planet.
I mean, that is super interesting. We'll have to do another webinar on that because the pharma sort of pipeline model as it is pretty much broken at the moment. And so, yeah, how can we disrupt that? So look, we're out of time. Thank you all so much for being so generous with your time and your insights and expertise. You've given us a lot to chew over, and it'll be really interesting to see how all of these themes pan out in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.